Hey everyone, I'm the Olivia and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. The moving truck pulled away, leaving me alone in front of my new home. It wasn't much. A weathered two-story house with peeling paint and ivy creeping up one side. But it was mine. After the divorce, I needed a fresh start, and this old place seemed like a good deal. Cheap rent, quiet neighborhood, and just enough space for me to figure out what life on my own looked like. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. A faint, musty odor like damp wood and forgotten corners. The realtor had warned me the house was old, but I wasn't prepared for how much it would creak. Every step I took made the floorboards groan, the sound echoing faintly through the empty halls. I set my box of essentials on the kitchen counter and took a moment to look around. The layout was straightforward. A narrow staircase to the left of the front door, a small living room with a fireplace and a kitchen at the back. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Simple. Manageable. By the time I'd unpacked the basics, a coffee maker, some plates, and a blanket, it was dark. The house seemed different at night, shadows pooling in the corners and the creaks louder than before. I told myself it was just my imagination and tried to focus on making the place feel like home. I was in the middle of hanging a picture when I heard it, a faint tapping sound from upstairs. It was rhythmic, like a slow, deliberate knock. I froze, listening. It. Probably just the house settling, I muttered, more to fill the silence than to reassure myself. So I climbed the stairs to check. The hallway was dim, lit only by the glow of the street lamp outside, and the sound had stopped. I stood there for a moment, holding my breath, but there was nothing. Just the creaks of the floorboards under my feet and the faint hum of the wind outside. When I turned to go back downstairs, I noticed something odd. The door to the guest bedroom was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it earlier. I pushed it open and peeked inside. The room was empty except for a few boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. The window was shut and there was no sign of anything out of place. Still, a chill ran down my spine. By the time I made it back to the living room, I was convincing myself that I was overreacting. It was an old house. Of course it had quirks. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the thin curtains in my bedroom. I had slept restlessly, plagued by strange dreams that faded as soon as I opened my eyes. The tapping sound from the night before felt like a distant memory, one I was eager to forget. After brewing a pot of coffee, I decided to explore the neighborhood. It was quiet and unassuming, with rows of similar old houses and neatly kept yards. I waved at a few neighbors but didn't stop to chat, feeling too self-conscious to make small talk. Later, as I was unloading more boxes from my car, an older woman appeared on the sidewalk. She was small and hunched, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Moving in, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy but kind. "Yeah," I said, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Just got here yesterday." She nodded, her gaze drifting to the house behind me. "That place has some history." I frowned. "History? Oh, nothing to worry about," she said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Just strange things. People don't tend to stay there long." My stomach tightened. "What kind of strange things?" She hesitated, then leaned in slightly as if to share a secret. "Footsteps when no one's there. Doors opening on their own. And that smell, like something rotting, they say." I forced a laugh. "It's an old house. Probably just drafts and bad plumbing." The woman didn't smile. "Maybe. Or maybe there's something the walls don't want you to know." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and shuffled away, leaving me standing there with a cold knot of unease in my chest. That night, the house felt different again. The air was heavy and every sound seemed amplified. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just nerves. I spent the evening unpacking, putting books on shelves and hanging curtains. By the time I crawled into bed, I was exhausted. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint noises, a creak here, a soft thud there. At one point, I thought I heard a whisper, low and unintelligible. I sat up, straining to listen. Nothing. Just the wind. I lay back down, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and told myself to stop being ridiculous. That's when the tapping started again. It was louder this time, more insistent. It, it, it. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. It was coming from the same place as before. Upstairs. Clutching my phone for light, I climbed out of bed and crept into the hallway. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. It was coming from the guest bedroom. I pushed the door open slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The room was just as I'd left it, but the tapping hadn't stopped. It was coming from the wall. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the sound originated. Slowly, I stepped closer and placed my hand on the wall. The wood felt cold, and the tapping stopped the moment I touched it. For a long moment, I stood there listening to the silence. Then, just as I started to turn away, I felt it, a faint vibration beneath my fingers, like something moving inside the wall. I stumbled back, my chest tightening with panic. What the hell was that? I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The morning light didn't chase away the unease that had settled over me. As I made my way downstairs, every creak of the floorboards felt deliberate, like the house was trying to remind me of its presence. I shook off the thought. Houses don't have intentions. Determined to distract myself, I threw myself into unpacking. By midday, I had most of the living room organized. A couple of framed photos sat on the mantel, and a stack of books was neatly arranged on the coffee table. It almost looked cozy. Around noon, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, a man in his mid-30s stood there, holding a potted plant. He had dark hair, an easy smile, and a slightly awkward demeanor. "Hey," he said, shifting the plant to his other hand. "I'm Greg. I live a couple of doors down. Thought I'd come by and welcome you to the neighborhood." "Thanks," I said, taking the plant. It was a leafy thing I didn't recognize. "I appreciate it." His gaze drifted past me into the house. "You're brave, you know. Moving in here." I stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" He scratched the back of his neck, looking sheepish. "Oh, nothing. Just, people talk, you know? About the house." I crossed my arms. "Let me guess. Footsteps, strange noises, that kind of thing?" Greg laughed nervously. "Something like that. The last guy who lived here? He bolted in the middle of the night. Said he heard voices." "Voices?" I asked, my stomach nodding. He nodded. Kept saying something was in the walls. I forced a smile, though my heart was racing. "Sounds like he had an overactive imagination." "Yeah, maybe," Greg said. But he didn't look convinced. That night, the house was anything but quiet. It started with the tapping again, soft at first but growing louder. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the doorway, too afraid to move. Then came the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable, starting at the bottom of the stairs and slowly climbing up. My throat tightened as I listened, counting each step. 1, 2, 3. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. 4, 5, 6. The footsteps stopped just outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crossed the room and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavier, colder. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The guest bedroom door, which I had shut tightly earlier, was open again. I stared at the guest bedroom door, my breath catching in my throat. It hung slightly ajar, the dim hallway light barely illuminating the darkness beyond. I could feel my pulse thundering in my ears as I stepped closer. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The door creaked open wider, revealing the room inside. It was empty, or so it seemed. The boxes I'd left scattered on the floor were untouched, but the air was colder than before, and the faint smell of mildew lingered. I shone my phone's flashlight into the corners of the room, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking there. But there was nothing. Just the creaks of the old house settling and the distant sound of the wind outside. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, backing out of the room. I pulled the door shut firmly, testing the handle to make sure it wouldn't swing open again. As I turned to head back to my bedroom, something caught my eye, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, moving across the wall at the far end of the hallway. I froze, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadow flickered for a moment, as if it were cast by a person walking. But there was no one there. I took a step forward, my throat dry. "Who's there?" Silence. And then, faintly, I heard it. A whisper, soft and unintelligible, like a voice carried on the wind. I turned and ran back to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was pounding as I leaned against the door, struggling to catch my breath. The whispers stopped, but the tapping started again, louder this time, echoing through the walls. The next morning I was a wreck. I hadn't slept a wink, and every noise the housemaid had kept me on edge. I decided it was time to learn more about the place. I headed to the local library, hoping to find some records or history on the house. After some searching, I came across an article from the 1950s about the original owner, a man named Henry Barlow. Barlow was described as a reclusive scholar with an interest in the occult. According to the article, he had moved into the house in 1922 and spent most of his life conducting strange experiments. Neighbors reported odd noises, flickering lights, and a constant stream of unusual visitors. The article ended with a grim note. Henry Barlow had disappeared without a trace in 1956, leaving behind a house full of strange symbols carved into the walls and floors. I felt a chill run down my spine. Symbols. I hadn't seen anything like that in the house yet, but the idea unsettled me. I decided to dig further. The librarian, an older woman with a knowing look in her eyes, handed me a faded book she thought might help. Echoes of the Forgotten, Hauntings of the Midwest. It had an entire chapter on my house. The chapter detailed a string of unexplained events tied to the property. Tenants reported footsteps, whispers, and a persistent feeling of being watched. One account described a tenant finding strange markings beneath the wallpaper, symbols carved into the wood. I closed the book, my hands trembling. When I returned home that evening, the house felt different. The air was thick, almost suffocating. As I stepped inside, I noticed a faint scratching sound like nails on wood. It was coming from the living room. I followed the sound, my stomach churning with dread. The noise stopped abruptly as I entered the room, but something caught my eye on the far wall. A crack in the paint I hadn't noticed before. I walked over, my fingers brushing against the uneven surface. The paint flaked off easily, revealing what looked like a faint carving underneath. It was a symbol, an intricate, swirling design etched deep into the wood. The room seemed to grow colder as I stared at it, my breath visible in the air. Behind me, I heard the faintest whisper. "Leave." I staggered back from the wall, my heart pounding as the whisper echoed in my ears. My head whipped around, but the room was empty. Still, the words seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. I stared at the carved symbol on the wall. The swirling lines and jagged edges didn't resemble anything I'd seen before. I reached out, hesitating before tracing a fingertip along the grooves. The wood was cold, colder than it should have been, and my skin prickled with a sudden, inexplicable chill. I needed answers. Grabbing my phone, I snapped a picture of the symbol and sent it to Greg, the only person I felt comfortable enough to ask. "Have you seen anything like this before? Found it under the paint in the living room." His response came quickly. "Greg *, where did you find that?" "Me * in the house." "What is it?" "Greg *, I don't know exactly, but I've seen drawings like that in old books. They're not good. Be careful." "Not good?" That wasn't exactly comforting. I decided to take a closer look at the rest of the house. I spent the next couple of hours searching every inch of the place. I peeled back corners of wallpaper, lifted rugs, and even pried off a loose floorboard in the guest bedroom. That's where I found it. Underneath the floorboard, tucked into a small hollow space, was a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked and worn, the leather dry and brittle. There was no title, just more of the strange symbols pressed into the surface. My hands shook as I opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten notes and sketches. Most of it was in English, but some passages were written in a language I couldn't understand, harsh, angular characters that hurt my eyes to look at for too long. The entries were dated, starting in 1923. March 15, 1923. "I have begun the rituals. The texts speak of power hidden beyond the veil, a doorway that can be opened with the proper incantations. The house was chosen for a reason. Its foundations sit upon ancient ground." June 9, 1924. "The shadows grow restless. I hear them at night, moving through the walls, whispering their demands. They promise knowledge, but at what cost?" October 31, 1925. "The doorway is open." The writing grew more erratic as the entries continued, the sentences spiraling into madness. The final entry was short, written in a shaky hand. Asterisk, they are here. I cannot close it. God help whoever comes next, asterisk. I slammed the book shut, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The room felt stifling, the air thick with a palpable tension. And then I heard it again, the whisper. This time it was clearer. You shouldn't be here. That night, I barricaded myself in my bedroom. I didn't trust the locks anymore. Not after the way the guest room door kept opening. I shoved a chair under the doorknob and tried to sleep, but the house had other plans. The tapping started again, louder than ever, coming from all around me. It was relentless, echoing through the walls like a heartbeat. Then came the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my door. I clutched the leather journal to my chest, my fingers digging into the worn cover. What do you want? I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then the air grew cold, bone-chillingly cold, and I felt it. The mattress dipped as if someone had just sat down beside me. I froze, too terrified to move. My breath fogged in the AC air as the weight on the bed shifted closer. And then, right next to my ear, a voice rasped. Leave, while you still can. The voice was gone as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me frozen in terror. The weight on the mattress lifted and the icy chill dissipated, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. I stayed motionless for what felt like hours, my back pressed against the headboard, clutching the journal like a shield. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I finally dared to move. My muscles ached from the tension, and my hands trembled as I eased out of bed. I couldn't stay here, not without understanding what I was dealing with. I spent the morning poring over the journal, trying to make sense of the entries. The symbols appeared repeatedly, some sketched in the margins, others taking up entire pages. The descriptions of the rituals were vague, but one word stood out: doorway. The entries spoke of opening a door to another realm, a place beyond the veil. Barlow's obsession had clearly consumed him, and whatever he'd unleashed hadn't left when he disappeared. I couldn't ignore the implications. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was something worse, something alive, its very foundation tainted by Barlow's actions. Desperate for answers, I called Greg and asked if he could come over. Are you sure that's a good idea? He asked hesitantly. Please, I said, my voice cracking. I can't do this alone. He agreed, albeit reluctantly. When Greg arrived, I showed him the journal and the symbol on the wall. He stared at it for a long moment, his face pale. I've seen this before, he said finally. There's a story people tell around here about Henry Barlow. They say he was into some dark stuff. Rituals, summoning things. The story goes that he didn't just open a door. He brought something through. Brought what through? I asked, my stomach twisting. Greg shook his head. No one knows. Whatever it was, it didn't leave when Barlow disappeared. And it's still here, isn't it? I nodded, my throat tight. Greg exhaled sharply. We need to find out if there's a way to close it. Maybe the journal has something. A loud bang interrupted him, reverberating through the house. We both jumped, turning toward the sound. What was that? Greg whispered. I don't know, I said, my voice barely audible. The bang came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor. It's coming from the basement, I realized. Greg looked at me, his expression a mix of fear and disbelief. You have a basement? I didn't even know until now, I admitted. We hesitated for a moment before Greg grabbed a flashlight. We have to check it out. The basement door was tucked away at the back of the kitchen, almost hidden behind an old pantry. It was an ancient wooden door, the paint peeling and the hinges rusted. As I reached for the handle, a chill ran down my spine. The air seemed to hum with tension, and my instincts screamed at me to turn back. But I opened the door anyway. The smell hit me first, a rancid, earthy odor that made my stomach churn. The stairs creaked ominously as we descended, the beam of Greg's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with low ceilings and crumbling stone walls. Strange markings covered the floor, faint but unmistakable, more of the symbols from the journal. In the center of the room was a large, circular symbol, deeply etched into the concrete. It pulsed faintly as if alive, and the air around it seemed to shimmer. This is it, Greg said, his voice trembling. This is the doorway. We didn't have time to process the discovery. The tapping started again, echoing through the basement walls. And then the whispering began. Dozens of voices, overlapping and indistinct, growing louder and more frantic. "We need to get out of here," Greg said, backing toward the stairs. But before we could move, the air in the room shifted. The temperature plummeted, and a dark, shadowy figure began to take shape in the center of the circle. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form twisting and writhing as if it were made of smoke. Its face, or what passed for one, was a void, an endless blackness that seemed to pull at the edges of my vision. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the figure stretched an elongated arm toward us. "Run!" Greg shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the stairs. We stumbled up the steps, the sound of the thing following close behind. I slammed the basement door shut and shoved the pantry in front of it, my heart racing. The house fell silent. For now. Greg and I sat in the living room, the journal open on the coffee table between us. The basement door hadn't made a sound since I'd barricaded it, but the silence was almost worse than the noise. "What the hell was that thing?" I asked, my voice shaking. Greg stared at the journal, his face pale. "I don't know, but it came from the doorway. And if the journal is right, it's not the only thing down there." His words sent a fresh wave of fear through me. "What do you mean, not the only thing?" He tapped one of the journal's entries, a passage from 1925. Asterisk, "The doorway is open. They come through in whispers and shadows. They feed on fear, grow stronger with every frightened breath." Asterisk. Greg looked at me, his expression grim. "Barlow didn't just summon one thing. He unleashed a whole, I don't even know what to call it, a presence. And it's been feeding on this house ever since." I stared at the page, the words blurring as panic threatened to take over. "There has to be a way to close it. Barlow must have left something in the journal." Greg nodded. "We need to keep looking." The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Greg stayed with me, and together we combed through the journal, searching for anything that might help. By evening we found it. A passage scrawled in the margins of one of the final entries. Asterisk, "The key is in the symbol. Burn it, destroy its form, and the door will collapse. But beware, the door fights back. It does not want to be closed." Asterisk. We exchanged a nervous glance. "The symbol in the basement," I said. "We have to destroy it." Greg hesitated. "You saw that thing same as I did. We go down there." "We don't have a choice," I interrupted. "It won't stop. Not until it gets what it wants." Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, but we're not going unprepared." We spent the next hour gathering supplies. Candles, matches, a fire extinguisher, just in case, and a small can of lighter fluid Greg had in his car. It felt absurd, like arming ourselves for a battle we couldn't hope to understand. As we stood at the top of the basement stairs, the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. "Are you sure about this?" Greg asked, his voice low. "No," I admitted, "but we have to try." The basement was even colder than before, the air thick with the stench of decay. The symbol in the center of the floor seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and the edges of the room were cloaked in shadow. The moment we stepped inside, the whispers began again. They were louder this time, angry, their words still indistinct but filled with a malice that made my skin crawl. Greg poured the lighter fluid over the symbol, his hands shaking. The liquid pooled in the grooves, darkening the intricate design. "Hurry," I whispered, glancing nervously at the shadows. They seemed to move, shifting and writhing like living things. Greg struck a match, the tiny flame casting flickering light across the room. He dropped it onto the symbol, and the fire roared to life. For a moment nothing happened. Then the room erupted into chaos. The whispers turned into screams, deafening and filled with rage. The shadows on the walls surged forward, forming into figures that twisted and writhed, their shapes barely human. The air grew impossibly cold, and the flames flickered, threatening to die out. "Keep it burning," Greg shouted, grabbing a candle and lighting it with the fire. He held it over the symbol, letting the wax drip into the flames. One of the shadowy figures lunged at him, its form stretching unnaturally. Greg stumbled back, swinging the candle like a weapon, and the figure dissolved into smoke. "They don't like the light," I realized, grabbing a flashlight and shining it toward another figure. It recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a kettle. The fire in the center of the room flared brighter, and the shadows began to dissolve, their screams fading into the distance. The symbol cracked, the lines splitting and crumbling as the concrete beneath it buckled. With a final burst of light and heat, The fire consumed the symbol entirely. The room fell silent. We stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the scorched floor. The shadows were gone, and the oppressive feeling in the air had lifted. "Did we do it?" Greg asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, a faint whisper echoed through the room. "You cannot close what has been opened." The chill returned, and I felt a cold hand brush the back of my neck. "We need to go," I said, grabbing Greg's arm. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we were outside, standing in the driveway under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. The cold night air felt sharp in my lungs, but it was nothing compared to the oppressive chill of the basement. Greg doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "We burned the symbol. That should have worked. Why didn't it work?" The whisper echoed in my mind, chilling and taunting. "You cannot close what has been opened." "I don't think it's just the symbol," I said, my voice trembling. "It's the house. It's all connected. Barlow didn't just open a door. He turned this whole place into a trap." Greg straightened, his face pale. "A trap for what?" I didn't have an answer, and the silence between us felt heavier than ever. We debated leaving right then and there, but something stopped me. The house had a pull, a magnetic, suffocating weight that wouldn't let me go. "I need to get my things," I said, my voice shaking. Greg stared at me like I was insane. "Your things? Are you serious? We just barely got out of there alive, and you want to go back in?" "I can't leave it like this," I said. "If we leave now, someone else will move in. They'll deal with the same nightmare. We have to finish this." Greg hesitated, his jaw clenched. Finally he nodded. "All right. But we're doing this together." We re-entered the house cautiously, flashlights in hand. The air inside felt different, thicker, darker, like the walls themselves were watching. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling, set my nerves on edge. But it wasn't until we reached the living room that we realized something was wrong. The burned symbol was there. Not in the basement where we'd destroyed it, but carved into the wall, jagged and raw, as though it had been etched into the wood with frantic desperation. "That wasn't there before," Greg whispered, his voice barely audible. The whispers started again, faint at first but growing louder. They didn't come from one direction. They were everywhere, surrounding us, echoing through the walls. And then the lights went out. The darkness was suffocating, and our flashlights flickered, their beams weak against the oppressive blackness. "Stay close," Greg said, his voice tight with fear. We moved toward the stairs, my mind racing. The journal had mentioned symbols. Multiple symbols. If the house was a trap, maybe there were more marks hidden somewhere. As we climbed the stairs, the whispers grew sharper, angrier. The air felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before us, impossibly long. Doors that hadn't been there before lined the walls, each one slightly ajar. "Do you see this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Greg nodded, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "This isn't right. This isn't." The door at the end of the hall slammed shut with a deafening bang, cutting him off. We moved toward the door, drawn by some unseen force. As we reached it, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. "This feels like a trap," Greg said. "It is," I replied, pushing the door open. Inside was a room I didn't recognize, one that shouldn't have existed. The walls were covered in symbols, the same jagged, swirling designs as before. In the center of the room was a small table, and on it sat an object wrapped in cloth. I stepped inside, the pull stronger than ever. Greg grabbed my arm. "Don't," he warned. But I couldn't stop myself. I unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small, blackened object. A key, twisted and malformed, yet unmistakable. The whispers exploded into screams, and the room shook violently. "Run!" Greg shouted, yanking me backward. We bolted down the hallway, the walls warping and bending as though the house itself was alive. The stairs seemed to stretch and twist beneath us, but we didn't stop, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. We reached the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, the air freezing as shadowy figures began to form around us. Greg grabbed a chair and hurled it at the nearest window. The glass shattered and icy wind poured into the room. "Go!" he yelled, climbing through the jagged frame. I followed, feeling the sharp edges of the glass scrape against my skin. The moment we were outside, the house went silent. We stood in the street, breathing heavily, staring at the dark, hulking shape of the house. "What the hell was that key?" Greg asked. I looked down at my hand, still clutching the object tightly. The key felt warm now, pulsing faintly as though alive. "I think it's part of the doorway," I said, my voice barely audible. "And I think we just made things worse." Greg and I sat in his car, parked a safe distance from the house. The engine was off, and the silence inside the vehicle was thick, broken only by our labored breathing. The key lay on the dashboard, a small, twisted thing that seemed to radiate an invisible weight. "It's connected to the house," I said, finally breaking the silence. "Whatever Barlow did, this key is part of it." Greg stared at it, his jaw clenched. "We should destroy it." I shook my head. "If it's part of the doorway, destroying it might make things worse. Could trigger something." Greg let out a frustrated sigh and leaned back in his seat. "So what? We just keep it? Carry around this cursed thing like a bomb waiting to go off?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But we need more answers. The journal isn't enough." The library in town was old and dusty, its shelves packed with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. The librarian, a small woman with sharp eyes, gave us a wary glance as we entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone curt. "We're looking for information on Henry Barlow," I said. Her expression darkened immediately. "Why? We're researching local history," Greg said quickly. The librarian hesitated before gesturing toward a section of old newspapers and records. "You won't find much. People around here don't like talking about Barlow or that house." "Why not?" I pressed. He gave me a long, hard look. "Because they know better." Greg and I spent hours combing through old records. We found articles about Barlow's disappearance in 1925, along with vague references to strange occurrences at the house. One article mentioned a group of townspeople who had reportedly tried to cleanse the property after Barlow vanished. They claimed to have sealed the doorway, but the article ended with an ominous note. Their efforts were unsuccessful. Another article, dated 1978, described a family who had moved into the house only to flee 3 months later. The father had reportedly been found wandering the streets, babbling about shadows and whispers. "This house has been cursed for decades," Greg said, his voice grim. "And we walked right into it," I muttered. As we left the library, the sky was overcast, the clouds heavy and gray. The air felt charged, like the calm before a storm. "We need to go back," I said. Greg stopped in his tracks. "Are you out of your mind? After everything that's happened, you want to go back there?" "We don't have a choice," I said. "The house isn't going to stop. It's connected to us now, whether we like it or not." Greg looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we're doing it right. We need a plan." That evening, armed with flashlights, candles, and a hastily assembled bag of supplies, we returned to the house. The key was tucked into my pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what we were up against. The moment we stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The air was heavy, the walls seeming to pulse faintly as though the house were alive. "We need to find the other symbols," I said, my voice low. Greg nodded, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Let's start upstairs." The upstairs hallway was warped, the doors from earlier gone, replaced by the familiar layout of the house. But the tension in the air was worse than ever. We checked every room, peeling back wallpaper and lifting rugs, searching for any sign of the symbols. It wasn't until we reached the attic that we found one. The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes. In the far corner, etched into the floorboards, was another symbol. "It's like the one in the basement," Greg said, kneeling beside it. I nodded. "We destroy it the same way." We poured lighter fluid over the symbol and lit a match. The flames licked at the wood, but this time the house reacted immediately. The walls groaned and the floor beneath us seemed to shift. The air grew colder and the shadows in the attic deepened, twisting into forms that moved toward us. Greg swung his flashlight at one of the shapes and it dissolved with a hiss. "Keep them back," I shouted, grabbing a candle and holding it up. The flames consumed the symbol, and with a final burst of heat, the shadows retreated, leaving the attic silent. "That's 2, Greg said, his voice shaking. "How many more do you think there are?" I asked. He didn't answer. We found the 3rd symbol in the living room, hidden beneath the carpet. This one was larger than the others, its lines deeper and more intricate. As we prepared to burn it, the whispers started again, louder and more aggressive than ever. "This is it," I said, my voice trembling. "This has to be the last one." The moment the flames touched the symbol, the house erupted into chaos. The walls shook, the lights flickered, and the air was filled with an ear-splitting roar. The shadows surged toward us, dozens of them, their forms barely human. "Light the candles," I shouted, throwing one to Greg. We held the flames between us and the shadows, their light pushing the figures back. But they kept coming, their screams echoing through the house. The symbol cracked and crumbled as the flames consumed it, and with a final, deafening roar, the shadows dissolved. The house fell silent. We stood in the center of the living room, breathing heavily, the charred remains of the symbol at our feet. "Is it over?" Greg asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, a low, rumbling laugh echoed through the house. "No," a voice rasped, deep and guttural. "It has only just begun." The front door slammed shut and the air grew cold again. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key, its surface glowing faintly. "It's still here," I said, my heart sinking. "And it's not going to let us leave." Greg grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Then we end this. Now." We turned toward the basement, the doorway to the source of the house's curse. The basement door creaked as we approached it, as though it recognized us, waiting for our next move. The shadows from the corners of the hallway stretched toward us like long fingers, grasping at our feet, trying to pull us back. But we had come too far to stop now. "We're not going down there," Greg said, his voice strained. "This place, this thing, it's not just a house. It's a prison. It's alive." I looked at him, feeling the weight of the key in my hand. "If we don't go down there, we're giving it what it wants. It's feeding on our fear, on the uncertainty we've been carrying. We have to finish this." Greg looked at the key, his expression grim. "All right, but if you're right, we have to destroy whatever's still holding this place together. No more half measures." I nodded. Together we stepped forward. The door to the basement groaned as I turned the handle, but when it opened, the room beyond was pitch black. No flickering light, no cold draft, just an oppressive, stifling darkness. The house seemed to breathe around us. "Ready?" Greg asked, his hand gripping a flashlight so tightly his knuckles were white. "No," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. But I stepped forward anyway. The moment we crossed the threshold into the basement, the air thickened around us. The familiar smell of damp wood and moldy stone was laced with something sour and metallic. The sound of distant whispers, like voices from another world, filled the space, growing louder with every step we took deeper into the room. The shadows clung to the corners like a living thing, shifting and writhing in the dim light of our flashlights. I could hear them, feel them, even when I couldn't see them. "We have to find it," I said, my voice shaking. Greg nodded, shining his flashlight across the room. "There's something wrong with this place. It's not just the symbols. It's the foundation of the house itself. It's built on whatever Barlow opened." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The very walls of the house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The air was thick, almost suffocating. It felt as though the house were aware of us, watching and waiting for us to make a mistake. As we moved farther into the basement, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye. A faint glow. "That's it," I said, rushing toward it. In the center of the room, beneath a thick layer of dust and debris, was an old iron-bound chest. The key in my hand burned against my skin, its glow pulsing in time with the whispers. Greg stepped forward cautiously. "Is that it?" I nodded, gripping the key tightly. "It has to be." I knelt beside the chest and inserted the key into the lock. It turned with an agonizing, screeching sound, and as the lid creaked open, the basement seemed to exhale as though it had been holding its breath. Inside the chest, wrapped in tattered cloth, was a book, its leather cover old and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. But what caught my attention the most was the symbol etched into its cover. It was the same symbol that had been burned into the floor, the walls, the attic. The one Barlow had created. I reached out and touched it. The instant my fingers made contact, the entire room seemed to shift like a deep, bone-chilling tremor running through the house. The whispers grew louder, sharper, becoming words. Terrifying words that clawed at my mind. "Open it." "No," I whispered, pulling my hand back. "We can't." But Greg had already grabbed the book. His eyes were wide, his face pale as he stared at the pages. "This is it," he said, his voice hoarse. This is Barlow's work. His rituals. As he flipped through the pages, the air seemed to grow colder. The house began to shake, the floorboards groaning as if something massive was shifting beneath us. Suddenly, a low growl, like the sound of something large and heavy moving in the dark, vibrated through the floor. The shadows around us writhed, and I felt a cold presence moving toward us, something ancient, hungry. "Put the book down," I shouted, but Greg didn't respond. His hands were trembling, his face contorted in a mixture of fascination and horror. "We need to finish this once and for all," he muttered. The ground beneath us cracked open with a deafening roar. The chest shook violently, the book in Greg's hands seeming to pulse with dark energy. And then the air itself split as though the house was tearing open. A doorway like the one Barlow had unlocked appeared before us. The shadows around us began to move faster, coalescing into figures, dark, distorted shapes that flickered in and out of existence, their eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger. Greg's voice cracked. "It's not over. We haven't finished it." But the shadows surged forward, their movements too fast, too chaotic. I reached for the book, trying to grab it from Greg's hands, but it was too late. The doorway opened wider, and from it came a sound like 1,000 whispers, all speaking at once, a chorus of anguish and rage. And then, in the center of the room, it appeared. A figure, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow. But its presence filled the room, its eyes glowing with a deep, unnatural light. It stepped forward, and the temperature in the room dropped to freezing. Greg dropped the book in terror, backing away. "We need to leave. Now." But it was already too late. The figure's hand shot out, fast as lightning, and I felt an icy grip close around my wrist. It pulled me forward, toward the doorway, toward whatever lay beyond. The house trembled as though fighting against the thing pulling us into the abyss. But it was too strong. The last thing I remember was the key. The key pulsed, its light growing brighter as the figure's grip tightened, and then everything went black. Chapter 11. Into the darkness. I woke up on the cold floor of the living room, gasping for breath. The house was silent. Greg was beside me, shaking me gently. "Are you all right?" I sat up, looking around. The walls were still, the shadows no longer moving. The air was thick but no longer oppressive. The house seemed still. "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Greg helped me to my feet, looking just as confused as I felt. "I don't know. We were pulled toward that doorway and then..." He trailed off. I glanced down at my hand. The key was gone. The house was different now. No more whispers, no more shadows. It was as though something had changed, something fundamental. But when I looked at Greg, I saw the same fear in his eyes. The fear that whatever we had unleashed was still out there. "We need to leave," Greg said, his voice shaking. "For good." I nodded, the weight of the house pressing against me, urging me to stay. But I couldn't. Not anymore. We left together, the door swinging open as if it had never been locked. The house stood behind us, silent, waiting for the next person to move in. We didn't speak much as we drove away from the house. The road stretched out before us, endless and dark, like it had no beginning or end. Neither of us knew where we were going, but it didn't matter. The house had become our obsession, its grip on us inescapable. Greg kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his eyes constantly scanning the road behind us. I didn't ask him what he was looking for. We both knew that even though we were miles away, we were still tied to it. The house wasn't done with us. It had only let us go for now. "I'm not going back," Greg said finally, his voice tight like he was fighting to hold it together. "I don't care what it takes. I'm done with that place." I didn't blame him. I felt the same way. But I knew that walking away wasn't as simple as it seemed. The key, the doorway, it wasn't just a part of the house. It was part of us now, too. "We can't outrun it," I said softly. "The house, it's waiting. It's always been waiting." Greg didn't respond, but the tension in his jaw told me that he understood. That night, neither of us slept. I kept staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that something was lurking just outside the window, watching us, waiting for the right moment. Every creak of the building, every passing car outside made my heart skip a beat. I could almost hear the whispers again, faint but undeniable, scratching at the edges of my mind. By morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I was exhausted, physically, mentally. I needed answers, something that could explain what had happened and maybe, just maybe, how we could make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. I'm going back, I said, breaking the silence between us. Greg turned to look at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. No, you can't be serious. I have to be, I replied. We left something behind. I thought about the key, now lost to whatever world that doorway had opened. I thought about the shadowy figure we had seen, the whispers, the cold air that had swallowed us whole. Something had to have changed in that house, something we had overlooked. Greg looked torn. I can't go back. I won't. You don't have to, I said quietly. But I do. I drove back alone. The road seemed longer this time, more isolating. As I neared the house, I could feel it again, that pull like gravity had shifted, drawing me back. My heart raced in my chest as I pulled up in front of the house. The place looked unchanged. The same cracked windows, the same dilapidated exterior. But it was different. I could feel it, the oppressive silence hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. I stepped out of the car and approached the front door. My hand hovered over the knob, the key still tucked deep in my pocket. As my fingers brushed against the cold metal, the house seemed to exhale, as though it had been holding its breath all this time. The door creaked open. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath me. The shadows were thick here, like the house itself was breathing. My breath caught in my throat as I stood at the threshold, trying to gather my thoughts. Nothing seemed out of place, no sounds, no whispers. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Barlow, I whispered, the name falling from my lips like a prayer. What did you do? Suddenly, the temperature dropped and I could see my breath in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt it before I saw it. Something was in the room with me, something other. A presence just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned, but the hallway was empty. My heart raced. It felt like I was being watched, like something was circling around me, waiting for me to make a move. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway. The house creaked, louder now, as though it were alive. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight. The walls whispered, their words incomprehensible but urgent. Get out. I turned back toward the front door, but it slammed shut before I could take a step. The walls around me seemed to close in, the air growing thick with the presence of something ancient and hungry. I was trapped. The floor beneath me buckled and I was thrown to the ground. The house rumbled as though it was shaking itself apart. I crawled toward the door, but the shadows were thick now, swirling around my feet, pulling at my ankles. The temperature plummeted even further and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. I had to get out. I had to leave before it was too late. But just as I reached the door, I saw it. The figure. The one from before. It stood at the end of the hallway, watching me with hollow eyes. Its body was long, twisted, its form flickering in and out of existence like a reflection in a shattered mirror. It took a step forward, and the ground beneath me seemed to split open, revealing nothing but darkness. I stumbled back, but my feet caught on something solid, something cold. I reached down, my fingers brushing against the small, twisted metal. It pulsed, faintly at first, then stronger, as though it had a life of its own. I could feel the power, the weight of it, pulling me forward. I had to destroy it. With all the strength I could muster, I yanked the key from the floor and slammed it into the ground, breaking the earth beneath it. The house screamed, a terrible primal sound that rattled my teeth. The figure in the hallway screeched, its form distorting as it began to melt into the darkness. And then, with one final, terrible shudder, the house fell silent. I didn't wait to see if the door would open again. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of there. My mind is a blur of fragments, flashes of shadows, of whispers, of things that shouldn't exist. But when I finally reached the car, when I finally drove away, I felt it, the last piece of the house slipping away, the grip loosening just enough for me to breathe. But even now, as I sit here in the dark, I can still feel it. The pull. The door we never truly closed. I can still hear the whispers, faint but insistent, coming from just beyond the walls. And I know, I know, the house is waiting. It always will be. Sorry. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to make a sudden, drastic change in my life. But here I was in Oak Hollow, in a house that seemed older than time itself. I had recently gone through a painful divorce, the kind where everything is dragged through the mud, leaving behind nothing but bitter feelings and a sense of disillusionment. I was tired of city life, tired of all the noise and endless reminders of a life that no longer existed. I needed something new. something different. When I found the house, I thought it was fate. Or maybe just good timing. Either way, it seemed like the perfect escape. I had no plans to stay in the city much longer, and this house, secluded, quiet, and tucked away on the outskirts of town, felt like the kind of place I could start over. The kind of place where no one knew my name, no one would ask about my past, and where I could just breathe. The real estate agent had been eager to show me the property. It's an old place, she'd warned me, but it's got character. She hadn't mentioned the history of the house, not at first. And honestly, I didn't ask. I was more focused on the price, the space, and the promise of a peaceful life in a small town. The house was massive, at least for one person. It stood at the end of a narrow, overgrown road, almost as if it were waiting for me to find it. The exterior had the kind of charm you'd expect from an old, weathered building. Dark wood, peeling paint, and windows that looked like they had seen better days. It was a fixer-upper, but I had no intention of rushing into any major renovations. I liked the idea of making it my own, bit by bit, and letting the house change along with me. Inside, the air smelled a little musty, the scent of aged wood and dust lingering in every room. The floors creaked underfoot, especially the stairs, which groaned with each step. The wallpaper was faded, but the place had a certain warmth to it. The rooms were large and open, with high ceilings and plenty of natural light. If I squinted, I could almost picture it looking pristine again, filled with light, laughter, and a fresh coat of paint. When I moved in, I was alone. No furniture to start with, just boxes of clothes, books, and a few personal items. It was a clean slate, which is exactly what I needed. I spent the first day unpacking, organizing, and figuring out where everything would go. I found a rhythm in the house, walking through its hallways, getting used to the sounds. The groan of the floorboards, the whisper of the wind outside rattling the windows. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. The town of Oak Hollow was small. Smaller than I had imagined. It had that sleepy, forgotten quality about it that made it feel like a place you could disappear into if you tried hard enough. The houses were all spaced far apart, and there was an eerie quietness that blanketed everything. The people were friendly, if a bit distant. Everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, but they were kind enough. I wasn't sure how long I'd stay, but the more I settled in, the more I found myself liking it. It was on the second day that I met my first neighbor. I had just finished setting up the kitchen when I heard a knock at the door. I hadn't expected anyone, but I went to answer it anyway. Standing there was a woman in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. Her hair was short and silver, her face weathered but kind. She wore a long, faded dress and a knitted shawl over her shoulders, and she had a cane in her hand. Her eyes were sharp, though, despite the softness in her expression. "Good morning, dear," she said in a warm voice that had a slight tremor to it. "I'm Ellen, I live just next door." I introduced myself, trying not to sound too eager. It was a small town, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to be friendly. "Welcome to Oak Hollow," she said, her eyes scanning the house behind me. "It's an old place, isn't it?" I nodded, smiling. "Yeah, it's been around a while. But I like it. It's got character." She nodded slowly, her gaze lingering on the house for a moment longer. "A lot of people say that," she murmured, almost to herself. "A lot of people also leave." That caught my attention, and I tilted my head slightly. "Leave?" I asked. "Why would they leave?" She looked at me, her expression softening. "Oh, nothing to worry about, dear. It's just that house. Well, it's got a history. Not everyone's up for it. Not everyone stays long enough to get used to it, if you know what I mean." I chuckled nervously, feeling the weight of her words settle on me. "I'm not superstitious," I said with a shrug, trying to brush it off. "I think I'll be just fine." She gave me a long look, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decide whether or not to say more. "Well," she finally said, her voice quieter now, "just be careful. People say strange things about that house. They say it changes you. Some folks hear things, see things. It's not for everyone." I raised an eyebrow, trying to keep the conversation light. "I'm sure it's just old pipes and the wind making noise. I'm used to old houses." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe. But just remember, not all things are as they seem. Sometimes it's best to leave well enough alone." I didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't outright threatening, but there was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. Still, I smiled politely and nodded, excusing myself from the conversation. She wished me well, her eyes lingering on the house for just a moment longer before she turned and left. I shook my head as I closed the door behind her, trying to laugh off the strange conversation. Oak Hollow was full of quirky characters, and I wasn't going to let one odd encounter ruin my good mood. The house was old, sure, but that didn't mean it was haunted or cursed. It was probably just the musings of a lonely old woman who liked to gossip. But as the day wore on, I couldn't help but notice a few things. Little things that hadn't been there before. The house was creaky. Okay, I had expected that. But the sounds felt different now. They seemed deliberate, almost as if the house was reacting to my presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that the floorboards groaned in protest whenever I stepped on them, or that the wind outside seemed louder, more insistent. I dismissed it. I had a tendency to let my mind wander, and being in a new place with no distractions probably made me a bit jumpy. It wasn't anything to worry about. That night, I decided to turn in early. It had been a long day, and the quiet of the house felt comforting after the chaos of the move. I stretched out on the bed, letting the cool sheets settle around me, and closed my eyes. But the peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I was woken by a sound, a faint thudding, almost like footsteps above me. I opened my eyes, wide awake now, and listened. It was quiet again, but I swore I had heard something. It wasn't the house settling, not this time. This was different. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like someone was walking around in the attic. I lay there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind or the house shifting. It had been an old place after all. Maybe the noise was just the pipes or something. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that I wasn't imagining it. Someone, or something, was walking around upstairs. I got out of bed, my heart racing in my chest. I stood still, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slow and steady. My pulse quickened. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I took a step toward the stairs, then another. But the moment my foot hit the bottom step, the sound stopped. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Was I imagining it? I waited for a moment, straining to hear anything. But there was only silence. The air felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few seconds. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the house was just settling like everyone said. But something in the back of my mind told me that it wasn't nothing. And whatever it was waiting for me to figure it out. The next morning, I woke up feeling unsettled. The footsteps from last night lingered in my mind, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. The cold air, the silence afterward, it all seemed too real to ignore. But I was determined to dismiss it. It had to be a coincidence, right? The house was old, with creaky floorboards and pipes that groaned. It was probably just the house settling, like everyone in Oak Hollow kept telling me. I got up and stretched, shaking off the uneasy feeling. I had work to do. There were still boxes to unpack, rooms to organize. I went to the kitchen to start my day, but the silence of the house felt oppressive. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. I tried to focus on the coffee brewing, but the sound of it bubbling seemed too loud in the stillness. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I was halfway through unpacking some books when I heard it again. A faint creaking, like something heavy shifting upstairs. My heart skipped a beat and I froze, listening closely. It wasn't the same rhythmic footsteps from last night, but it was definitely something moving up there. I set the box down and stood still, straining my ears. The sound stopped as soon as I focused on it. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a squirrel in the attic or the wind shaking something loose. It was an old house after all. But the sound had been deliberate and I knew it. I grabbed a broom from the closet and cautiously made my way upstairs, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation for the noises. The stairs creaked under my weight, groaning in protest as I ascended. The moment I reached the top, the silence returned. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved through the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. I peered into the spare room, the one I'd planned to use for storage. It was empty, just like the rest of the house, with nothing unusual to see. I turned to the attic door, which was tucked away at the end of the hall. The wooden door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint sliver of darkness beyond it. I hadn't opened the attic yet, but I knew there was a pull-down ladder in the closet. It was a relic from another time, something I hadn't yet bothered to explore. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should investigate or just pretend I hadn't heard anything. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped toward the door and gently pushed it open. The attic was darker than I expected, the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. Dust filled the air and the scent of old wood hit me like a wall. I could see the faint outline of boxes and forgotten furniture piled high, the remnants of previous tenants. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something strange. There was an odd symbol drawn in chalk on the floor just a few feet from the ladder. It was nothing I recognized, just a circle with jagged lines crossing through it. It looked old, as if someone had drawn it years ago. I knelt down to get a closer look, my fingers brushing the dusty floor. I felt a strange shiver run through me, but I couldn't place why. The symbol itself was nothing more than a curiosity, just an odd mark left behind by someone who probably had forgotten all about it. But the longer I stared at it, the more uncomfortable I felt. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again, and I could almost feel something watching me, waiting. I stood up quickly, brushing the dust off my knees. Whatever this was, I didn't want to stick around to figure it out. I backed away from the attic, my pulse racing. The moment my foot hit the first step of the ladder, I heard it again, faint, distant footsteps from somewhere in the house. I froze, holding my breath. This time it was not from the attic. It was coming from below, from the first floor. I turned and quickly descended the ladder, my heart hammering in my chest. I rushed down the stairs, trying to dismiss the feeling of being watched. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I looked around. There was no one there, of course. But the house felt different now, heavier, as if it were filled with something unseen. I spent the rest of the day trying to stay busy. I unpacked more boxes, rearranged things, even cleaned the windows in an attempt to shake off the growing sense of unease. But the noises persisted, like a faint hum in the background of my mind. Each time I heard something, a creak, a groan, a footstep, I found myself looking over my shoulder. The house wasn't just old, it was alive. And I was beginning to wonder if it was alive in a way I didn't understand. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I needed to clear my head, get away from the house for a while. The air was cool, crisp, with just a hint of autumn. The leaves rustled in the trees, the only sound besides my footsteps as I walked down the narrow road. The houses on either side of me were dark, the lights in the windows flickering faintly. Oak Hollow was quiet, too quiet. As I rounded the corner near the end of the street, I noticed Ellen standing in her yard, watching me. She was facing the house, her expression unreadable. She hadn't seen me yet, but I felt a shiver run through me, as if she knew I was there. Her eyes flicked to mine, and she gave me a small wave. "Everything all right?" she called out, her voice carrying across the quiet air. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to say. The strange feeling in my gut had returned. Yeah, just needed some fresh air. She didn't answer right away, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "I hope you're not hearing things," she said finally, her voice low and almost conspiratorial. "That house, it has a way of getting inside your head." I didn't know how to respond. It was as if she had read my thoughts. I could feel my stomach twist in knots, but I forced myself to smile. "I'm sure it's just the house settling," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. "It's old after all." She nodded slowly, a strange glint in her eyes. "Just don't ignore the signs, dear. Some things, once you let them in, they don't go away." I didn't want to talk about it anymore, so I quickly excused myself and turned to head back to the house. I could feel her eyes on my back, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me for some reason. That night, as I lay in bed, the noises returned. This time they were louder, more distinct. Footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway just outside my door. My heart raced, and I sat up in bed, straining to listen. They stopped. I waited, counting the seconds. Then, just as I thought it might be over, a faint whisper reached my ears. It was almost imperceptible, like the wind moving through the cracks in the walls. But it wasn't the wind. The voice, if you could even call it that, was hushed, too quiet to understand. I stood up, my legs trembling, and tiptoed to the door. I opened it a crack, peering into the dark hallway. Nothing. No one. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, just beyond my vision, waiting in the shadows. I closed the door behind me, my mind racing. The house felt colder now, the air thick with tension. I could still hear the faint whispers, like a distant murmur in my ears. Something was happening here. Something I didn't understand. And it was starting to make me question whether I could stay. The day after my unsettling conversation with Ellen, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the house was watching me. Each creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that made the old windows rattle, seemed to echo with a hidden meaning. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed to find out more about this house. I had to know what kind of history I was dealing with, what had happened here before I ever stepped foot inside. So that morning I set off for the Oak Hollow Library. It wasn't far from my house, just a short walk down the main road, nestled between a row of old shops and a few houses. The town was so small that everyone knew everyone else, and I figured the librarian might know something about the house's past. Oak Hollow had the look of a town that kept its secrets buried, but surely someone would be willing to talk. As I stepped inside the library, a quiet bell above the door jingled, and I was greeted by the scent of old paper and polished wood. It was exactly what you'd expect from a small town library, dimly lit with rows of dusty bookshelves stretching up to the high ceiling. There were only a few people inside, most of them seated at tables reading or browsing through old newspapers. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, scanning a book. She looked up as I approached, her eyes sharp and observant despite her age. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm for the bustling quiet of the library. "I'm looking for some information about a house," I said, trying to sound casual. "The Sullivan House. Do you have anything on it?" Her expression shifted just slightly, as though she had expected me to ask. "The Sullivan place," she echoed, her eyes narrowing. "I'm sure you've heard the stories." I nodded, not sure how to respond. "I've heard bits and pieces. People say strange things happen there." She sighed deeply, leaning back in her chair. "Well, I suppose I could point you in the right direction. There's some history here that might interest you. The Sullivan House has a reputation, you know. A reputation for strange happenings." "Strange happenings?" I repeated, my interest piqued. "Like what?" "Old stories," she said, her voice lowering. "Things that people tend to forget or sweep under the rug. But some of us remember. The house wasn't always just a place to live. People say that it was built by a man who was obsessed with the occult. A man named Arthur Sullivan." She paused, letting her words hang in the air for a moment, as if weighing whether to continue. Arthur Sullivan was a wealthy man in the early 1900s. He was a reclusive figure, never socialized much with the townsfolk, but he was known for his strange interests. He studied alchemy, mysticism, and the supernatural. It wasn't long before people started talking about him, about his peculiar rituals, his obsession with the occult. Some even say that he was trying to contact otherworldly beings, to open doors to places humans were never meant to go. Her voice trailed off, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "What happened to him?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "The stories vary," she said, leaning forward as if she were about to share something deeply personal. "But the most consistent one is that one night Arthur Sullivan disappeared. No one knows exactly when or how. Some say he went mad, others say he succeeded in his rituals. The house was left vacant for years after that, and over time, people forgot about it." "But you didn't forget," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, dear," she replied with a solemn nod. "Some things stay with you." I stood there for a moment, digesting the weight of what she'd told me. Arthur Sullivan, a man obsessed with the supernatural, had lived in the very house I now called home. And now strange things were happening to me, footsteps, whispers, the cold spots. I felt a gnawing sense of dread in my gut. "Is there more?" I asked. "Anything that might explain the noises I've been hearing?" She looked at me, her eyes narrowing as if she were deciding whether to reveal more. "You should speak to Dr. Harris. He's done research on the house. He might have more details. He's a local historian, lives just down the road." She didn't need to say more. I was already walking out the door before she could finish her sentence. Dr. Harris was my next stop. Dr. Harris was easy enough to find. His house was a modest, well-kept building a few blocks from the library. As I walked up to the front door, I noticed the thick collection of books and old journals in the windows. A small plaque near the door read, "Local History Researcher." I knocked, and within moments, the door creaked open to reveal a tall, thin man in his mid-50s with a neatly trimmed beard and wire-rimmed glasses. His eyes were sharp, scanning me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice warm but with a hint of reserved professionalism. "I'm looking for information about the Sullivan House," I said, feeling a bit self-conscious. "I was told you might have some research on it." Dr. Harris's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. A brief, almost imperceptible hesitation. He nodded and motioned for me to come inside. "I've written a lot about that place," he said, his voice calm as he closed the door behind me. "It's a story that never quite leaves this town. Please have a seat." I sat in the living room, which was cluttered with books, maps, and old historical documents. There was a distinct mustiness in the air, the scent of paper and time itself. Dr. Harris sat across from me, his eyes studying me carefully. "You've heard the rumors, I take it?" he asked. I nodded. "I've heard bits and pieces. People say strange things happen there." Dr. Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Strange things don't quite capture it," he said quietly. "The truth is, the house was built on something more than just land. Arthur Sullivan wasn't the only one who believed in the supernatural. He was simply the most vocal. He invited people from all over the world to join him in his experiments. Alchemy, rituals, anything that might open the door to another world." "Another world?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Yes," he said, his tone almost reverent. "Sullivan believed that there were other dimensions, worlds that existed alongside ours. And he thought he could access them, summon beings from beyond, force a connection. He used the house as his base of operations, performing rituals in secret. But over time, the rituals became more erratic, more dangerous. He grew obsessed with something he called the door, a gateway, a passageway to another realm." My heart raced. I could feel the weight of his words settle on me, a thick, suffocating pressure. "Did he succeed?" I asked, unable to keep the fear from creeping into my voice. Dr. Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a leather-bound book on the table in front of him. He opened it to a page marked with a worn, yellowed piece of parchment. "Arthur Sullivan kept a journal," he said, detailing his experiments, his successes, and his failures. He wrote about the door, the doorway to another world. According to his notes, he succeeded once, opening a rift between worlds. I felt a cold chill wash over me. The footsteps, the whispers, it all made sense now. The house was no longer just a home. It was a vessel, a place where something had crossed over. And it had never left. "Do you have the journal?" I asked, my voice shaking. Dr. Harris paused, looking at me carefully. "I do," he said. "But you need to understand, Arthur Sullivan's work was dangerous. The entities he contacted, they weren't meant to be contacted. They're still here. And they won't stop until they're free." The words echoed in my mind as I stood up to leave. I could hear the faint sounds of footsteps in the hallway outside, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I was no longer alone in the house. Something had followed me. With the unsettling knowledge of Arthur Sullivan's dark past heavy on my mind, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread in my own house. Something had been awakened, something that shouldn't have been, and it was slowly inching closer to me. As the days passed, the strange occurrences became more frequent and impossible to dismiss. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold spots, they were now a constant presence in my life. And they weren't going away. But what was more troubling was the feeling that I was no longer in control of my own space. Something had changed inside me since I moved in. Something I couldn't explain. Every room felt smaller, darker. The shadows stretched longer, and the silence seemed more oppressive. I knew I had to find the journal. I had to know what Sullivan had written, what he had uncovered, and most importantly, what he had unleashed. The house wasn't just old, it was cursed. And it seemed to be calling me. The house had changed since I first moved in. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if something ancient and oppressive had settled within its walls. The creaks of the floorboards were louder, more insistent, and at night the darkness seemed deeper, more consuming. It was no longer just a house. It felt like a trap, and I was the prey. The footsteps continued, louder, more distinct, always coming from somewhere just out of sight, always lingering just on the edge of my hearing. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to a cold draft sweeping through the room, or the sensation of something brushing past me in the dark. But every time I turned around, there was nothing. And yet I could feel it, the presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been awakened here was growing stronger with each passing day. The journal. I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Harris's words. Sullivan's journal held the answers, the key to understanding what had been unleashed. If I could just find it, maybe I could make sense of the madness. Maybe I could close whatever door had been opened. But how? I had to act fast. The whispers, the footsteps, whatever was in the house with me, wasn't content with simply haunting me anymore. I could feel its presence growing closer, more insistent, and I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before it found me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I returned to Dr. Harris's house that afternoon. My heart pounded in my chest as I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet street. This time I had a purpose. I needed that journal. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Dr. Harris answered quickly, as if he had been expecting me. His face was ashen, his eyes tired, as though he hadn't slept in days. "I need to see the journal," I said, my voice firm despite the dread gnawing at my insides. "I need to know what happened." He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there looking at me as though weighing my request. Finally, he sighed and stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. "Follow me," he said, his voice low, barely audible. I followed him through the cluttered hallway into a small study at the back of the house. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty tomes and forgotten relics of history. In the center of the room was a heavy oak desk, cluttered with papers and journals. But it was the journal on the desk that caught my eye, worn and weathered, the leather cover cracked with age. It was open, as though Dr. Harris had been reading it recently. He handed it to me without a word, and I hesitated for a moment before taking it. The weight of it in my hands was unnerving, as though the book itself was burdened with the knowledge of things no one was ever meant to know. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling, and began to read. The journal entries were fragmented, erratic, as though Sullivan's mind had been slowly unraveling over time. The first few pages detailed his experiments, his obsession with opening a door to another world. There were sketches, strange symbols and sigils, arcane drawings that seemed to writhe on the page as though they were alive. The further I read, the more unsettling the entries became. "I have felt the presence," one entry read. "The door is closer now. I can hear them. Their voices call to me, beckoning me to open the threshold. I must be ready. I must be prepared." The next entry was even more disturbing. "They are here. I have done it. I have opened the door. But it is not what I thought. They are not what I thought. They are watching, waiting. The rift is growing. I can feel them, their eyes upon me. It is only a matter of time before they find a way through." I flipped the page, my breath coming faster now, a sense of terror building in my chest. The rift is open. I can hear them. They are speaking to me, but I cannot see them. Their voices are everywhere, whispering in my ear, urging me to open the door wider. I do not know how much longer I can resist. The final entry was the most chilling. "I have done what I had to do. The door is open and they are coming. There is no turning back now. They are here in the house with me. I can feel their presence. They are waiting. I have made a terrible mistake." I couldn't breathe. I felt as though the walls were closing in on me, the air growing thin. I could feel something stirring inside the house, something ancient, something that had been waiting for years, perhaps even centuries, to be released. Sullivan had opened the door. And now whatever had been on the other side was here. It had crossed over, and it wasn't going to leave. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked up at Dr. Harris, who had been watching me silently as I read. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Do you see what has happened? The door was opened, and whatever was on the other side, it's not done yet. It wants to come through completely. But how do I stop it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Harris hesitated, his eyes haunted. "You can't. No one can. The only way to stop it is to close the door. But no one has ever succeeded in doing that. No one who has tried has lived to tell the tale." I could feel the cold air in the room growing even colder, as though something was standing behind me. I could almost hear the whispering just on the edge of my hearing. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, the corners of the walls pulling inward. "It's too late," Dr. Harris whispered. "You've been marked. It knows you now. And it won't stop until it has you." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, my stomach twisting in horror. I had to get out. I had to leave. Without another word, I turned and bolted out of the room, running through the house and out the door. The street outside was quiet, but I could feel something following me. The whispering, the footsteps, they were right behind me, just out of reach. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my house, but even then I knew it was only temporary. The presence was still there, lurking just beyond my vision, watching, waiting. The door had been opened, and now there was no turning back. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The shadows, the dark figures from the corners of my vision, standing just beyond the reach of the light. I tried to shake the image, but it lingered, persistent, pressing against my thoughts. I knew what I had to do, but every part of me rebelled against the idea. The house had been quiet since I returned, but I could feel it, a simmering tension that made my skin crawl. I was trapped. Whatever Arthur Sullivan had opened, whatever he had called into the house, it wasn't going away. I had read the journal and now I knew the truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a gateway. A doorway between worlds, and the things that had crossed over were waiting for something I wasn't sure I could give them. The clock ticked in the silence, the only sound in the room, and I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the darkened walls. I wanted to get out. I wanted to leave everything behind, to run far away and never look back. But the whispers, those soft, insistent voices, kept pulling me back. They were calling just beneath the surface of my thoughts, urging me to listen, to understand, to open the door wider. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding. The air in the room had become thick, suffocating, and I could barely breathe. It wasn't just the weight of my fear. It was something else, something oppressive, something that seemed to hang in the very air. I walked out of my room, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The house was silent, too silent, but I knew better than to trust the quiet. I had learned that much in the short time I'd been living here. The house was never truly empty. I made my way down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath my feet, each groan of the floorboards sending a shiver down my spine. I reached the living room and froze, my breath catching in my throat. The room was colder than usual, a sharp chill that bit into my skin like ice. I could see my breath, fogging the air in front of me, and I knew then that something was wrong. More wrong than usual. The shadows in the room were different tonight. They seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. I could feel them, those dark shapes, gathering in the corners of the room, watching me. And then, just as I was about to turn and flee, I heard it. A voice, faint at first, but growing louder, clearer. It came from the darkness, from the farthest corner of the room. "Come closer." My blood ran cold. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. I didn't move. My body was frozen in place, my muscles locked with terror. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. "Come closer," the voice repeated, its tone now more insistent, more commanding. I couldn't resist. I didn't want to resist. Something deep within me urged me forward, pulling me closer to the shadows, to the voice. I stepped toward the corner, my feet moving on their own, as though some invisible force was guiding me. The air grew colder the closer I got, until I could feel the chill seeping into my bones. When I reached the corner, the shadows seemed to part, revealing a dark shape in the center of the room. It was tall, taller than any human figure should have been, and its form was shifting, undulating like smoke. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was watching me, its gaze pressing against my mind, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. "Why are you here?" the voice asked, its tone low and mocking. "Why did you open the door?" I couldn't answer. The words caught in my throat, choked by the fear that was slowly swallowing me whole. The figure stepped forward, its shape flickering in and out of existence, as if it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be here or not. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, gliding across the floor without making a sound. I tried to move, tried to back away, but my body wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the presence of whatever it was. "Don't be afraid," the voice continued, its tone soft now, almost soothing. "You belong here just like the others. You are ours now." The words washed over me, sending a wave of nausea through my body. I felt sick, my head spinning, as though I were being pulled under the surface of some dark, bottomless ocean. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then suddenly the figure was gone. The room was silent again, the shadows receding into their corners. The coldness faded, but the sense of dread remained, hanging in the air like a fog that wouldn't lift. I stood there, trembling, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Well, I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. Whatever it was real. I turned and fled up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of the darkness pressing down on me with each step. When I reached my room, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, but the terror wouldn't subside. My body was shaking, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I closed my eyes, but even then I could still see it. The shadow, the figure, its glowing eyes locked on me, watching me. And I could hear it too. the whispering faint and distant but growing louder with each passing second. Come closer. I couldn't escape. I couldn't hide. It was already here in my mind, in my heart, in the very walls of this house. And it wasn't going to leave. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, not after that night. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The fear, the whispers, the shadows, they were all starting to blur together. I could no longer tell where the house ended and my mind began. The boundaries were slipping and I was falling through them. There was only one thing I knew for certain. Something was here with me. Something ancient. Something hungry. But no matter how much I wanted to leave, no matter how desperately I searched for a way out, I couldn't bring myself to pack my things and walk away. Part of me was terrified, yes, but another part, the part that had been drawn here, that had opened that damn door, was addicted. It was as though I was bound to this house now, bound to whatever had been unleashed within its walls. I didn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows. They were always there, waiting in the corners, flickering at the edge of my vision. And the whispers, they never stopped. They followed me, beckoning me, urging me to come closer, to listen, to understand. They weren't just voices. They were a part of me now, embedded in my thoughts, tangled in the deepest parts of my mind. I spent hours searching the house, looking for something that could explain what was happening, anything that could make sense of the madness. I combed through every room, every closet, every drawer, but found nothing. Nothing except for the feeling that I was being watched. Every corner I turned, every dark space I entered, I felt eyes on me, invisible but omnipresent. It was on the fourth day, when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, that I finally found something. A hidden door. I was in the basement, looking through old crates and boxes of forgotten belongings, when I came across a section of the wall that didn't seem quite right. The stone was colder here, smoother. I ran my fingers over it and there was a slight give. I pushed and to my surprise the wall moved. Behind it, there was a narrow staircase leading down into total darkness. I hesitated at first, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but the whispers, those damn whispers, spurred me on. Go, they said. Down the stairs. You need to know. I knew I had no choice. I had to see it. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. I descended slowly, the air growing colder with each step. The darkness seemed to wrap itself around me, suffocating and oppressive. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with strange artifacts, old books and faded photographs. At the far end of the room stood a large wooden chest, its surface worn and chipped as if it had been here for centuries. Something about the chest called to me, an unsettling magnetism pulling me toward it. I walked over to it, my hands trembling, and opened it. Inside there was a collection of old journals, much like the one Dr. Harris had shown me. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded, but as I flipped through them I realized they weren't just journals. They were records. Records of rituals, of ceremonies, of something that looked far too much like the occult for my liking. One of the journals caught my eye. It was different from the rest. Much older, its leather cover blackened and cracked. I opened it and immediately the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel the air thickening around me, growing heavy, as though the very presence of the book was pulling something into the room. I began to read. The words were in Latin, but there was an unsettling familiarity to them. As I continued, I recognized some of the symbols from the journal I had found earlier. Sullivan had copied these same markings in his notes, desperate to understand them. And as I read further, I realized the full extent of what had been done here. The book spoke of rituals. Rituals designed to open a door between worlds. The door. The very same one Sullivan had opened. But this was different. This wasn't just some naive scholar seeking knowledge. This was something darker. The rituals described in the book were not meant to summon knowledge. They were meant to summon something else. Something far worse. A creature. Something ancient. Something powerful. It had been bound to this world, trapped behind the door for eons. And once the door was opened, it would be free. I slammed the book shut, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I turned to flee, something caught my eye, something in the corner of the room. A figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it move. It was tall, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden in darkness. But I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the gloom. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my body frozen in terror. And then, in the stillness of the room, I heard the voice. "Now you understand." The words were like ice, cutting through the air with a sharpness that made me shudder. "You opened the door," it continued, its voice low and mocking. "And now you will see what happens when you call upon things that should never be seen." I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything to escape. But it was too late. The creature, the thing, was here. And there was no escape. No way to undo what had been done. I felt the temperature drop even further, felt the walls of the room close in around me until I could hardly breathe. The air was thick with something foul like rot, and the smell made my stomach churn. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was silent once more, but I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it. The presence was still there, lingering in the shadows, waiting. I ran upstairs, stumbling, my mind racing. The house seemed alive now, the walls pulsing with some unseen energy. The shadows were closing in. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I had opened the door. And now whatever was on the other side had come for me. The night had fallen heavily, almost suffocatingly, as I stood in the middle of my living room. The house felt different now, as though it had shifted around me, its walls growing tighter, its floors creaking with unnatural rhythm. I wasn't sure what I had expected after reading the book, after learning the truth about the door, but this was something beyond comprehension. The thing in the basement, the dark figure. It wasn't a ghost, not in any traditional sense. It wasn't some lost soul or restless spirit. No, it was something else. Something older. Something that had been bound to the house, bound to this world in some way I still didn't understand. And now that I had opened the door, it was free. I had never believed in monsters, not truly. Not the way children believed in them. Under the bed, in the closet, in the dark spaces where shadows lurked. I thought they were just stories, just whispers to make the world feel a little more mysterious, a little more frightening. But I had learned the hard way that some stories were true. And some monsters weren't just figments of imagination. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to leave. I had to find a way to escape. I grabbed my coat and headed toward the door, but as my hand touched the knob, I froze. The air in the room had changed. It was colder, heavier, like something was pressing against the very walls, pushing in from all sides. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch further than before, as though they were trying to reach me, trying to pull me back into the darkness. The whispers returned, softer now, but still there. "Where do you think you're going?" I spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing. Nothing except the oppressive silence. The shadows pressed in closer, the room seeming to shrink with every breath I took. I took a step back, my mind racing. The whispers had been in my head before, but now they felt like they were all around me. They were coming from the walls, from the floor, from the very air. And they were growing louder, more insistent. "Come back," they coaxed. "You can't leave. You belong here." The words made my skin crawl. I couldn't understand it. I had no idea what they wanted from me, but deep down I knew that whatever it was, it wasn't good. They had been patient, waiting for me to make the wrong choice. And now they had me exactly where they wanted me. I turned and ran. I had no destination in mind, no plan, just the desperate need to escape. My feet pounded against the floor, my breath ragged and uneven. But the house, no, the entity that had taken root here, wasn't going to let me go that easily. I could hear it now, the sound of something following me, something heavy, something relentless. The footsteps were getting closer, the air growing colder with each passing second. I sprinted down the hall, past the stairs, towards the front door. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the door itself was resisting me, refusing to open. I tried again, pulling harder, but the door remained sealed shut. The whispers were louder now, drowning out everything else. "Stay," they urged. "You can't leave." The temperature in the room dropped even further, until my breath came out in visible puffs of mist. I felt a pressure on my chest, as though the air itself was becoming thicker, harder to breathe. The shadows in the corners of the room began to swirl, shifting like liquid, moving towards me, coalescing into something. Someone, standing just out of my reach. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, my blood running cold. It was her. The woman from the photograph, the one I had seen in the basement earlier. She was standing in the hallway, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted in a twisted, unnatural smile. She wasn't breathing. Her skin was ashen, her body gaunt and emaciated, as though she had been starved. Her clothes were torn, stained with something that looked like blood, and her hands were outstretched, as though she was reaching for me. I stumbled backward, terror flooding through me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind was frozen in place, caught in the grip of something far more powerful than fear. "You open the door," she whispered, her voice like nails scraping against glass. "And now we are free." I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The room seemed to spin, the shadows closing in around me, tightening their grip. The woman took a step toward me, and with each movement the temperature dropped further. My teeth chattered, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "The door," she repeated, her voice a hiss, "was never meant to be opened. But you did. And now we will take what is ours." I turned and ran again, but this time I didn't make it far. I felt something cold and heavy grab my arm, pulling me back. I struggled, but it was no use. I was being dragged toward her, toward the shadowy figure that had become more real, more tangible with each passing moment. I fought harder, my nails digging into the floor, but it was as though the house itself was holding me in place, trapping me. I could feel the coldness seeping into my very bones, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging me to stop struggling, to give in. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I was back in the living room, standing in the center of the room, the door still shut, the shadows retreating into the corners. The temperature had returned to normal, and the whispers had faded, leaving only a faint echo in my mind. I was alone. I stood there for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But nothing made sense anymore. The house, the whispers, the shadows, they were all real. And I had opened the door. I had brought whatever it was into my life. And it was only a matter of time before it took what it wanted. I stumbled back toward the door, desperate to leave, desperate to escape, but deep down I knew there was no escape. I could feel it, whatever had been unleashed, pressing in on me, watching me, waiting for the right moment. And then, in the silence of the room, I heard it again. The whispers. "Come back." I could no longer pretend that I was in control, that I had some measure of safety within these walls. No matter how many times I tried to leave, no matter how fast I ran, the house had a hold on me. The shadows, the whispers, the unseen force, they were all part of this place, a place that had never truly welcomed me. I had merely been its newest visitor, and now I was trapped. The fear gnawed at me, relentless, but I still couldn't bring myself to abandon the house completely. It was as if a part of me was still tethered to it, as though leaving meant abandoning something essential. I had read enough of the journals, heard enough of the whispers, to know that whatever this house contained, whatever evil had been unleashed, it needed me. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I hadn't imagined the woman, that I hadn't hallucinated the coldness, the shadows, or the whispers. But I knew better now. This was real. And it was only getting worse. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Alive with something ancient, something that had been waiting for the right moment to return. The thing that Sullivan had brought into this world was here now. And it was growing stronger. That night the house felt different. The air was thicker, like it had been soaked in something foul. The whispers were louder too. They no longer just lingered in the corners of my mind. Now they surrounded me, crawling along the walls, slipping between the floorboards, pushing against the windows. They were everywhere, all at once, as if the very house itself was speaking to me. "Come closer. Come back. Let us in." I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block them out, but the words wouldn't stop. They bled into my thoughts, suffocating every rational thought I tried to have. It was as if the house was trying to burrow into my mind, to make me listen to it, to understand what it wanted. But I couldn't, I wouldn't. The silence had always been unnerving, but the constant whispering was worse. It was like the house was trying to convince me to stay, trying to pull me back in. I couldn't let it. I had to leave. I had to get out before it consumed me entirely. I reached for my phone, desperate to contact someone, anyone, Dr. Harris, a friend, even a stranger, but the screen was cracked. No signal. The house had swallowed me whole, cutting me off from the outside world. I felt isolated, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. I grabbed my jacket and made my way to the front door again. But this time, as I touched the doorknob, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't cold like it had been before. Oh, it was warm, unnaturally warm. I pulled my hand back, a jolt of panic running through me. I knew what this was. It was an invitation. The house was offering me a way out, but it was a trap. I spun around, looking for another exit. But there were no windows to crawl out of, no back door to sneak through. It was just me, the oppressive weight of the walls closing in around me. The air grew colder again, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, and deliberate, coming from the upstairs hallway. They were too steady, too methodical. Whoever, or whatever, was making them was moving toward me. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tense. I knew what was happening. I had read about it, seen it, felt it. Whatever was trapped in this house wasn't finished yet. And now it was coming for me. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my feet pounding against the creaky floorboards. I could hear the footsteps gaining on me, following me, getting closer and closer. The house groaned and shifted as if it were alive, as if it were part of the very force chasing me. I stumbled into the living room, my chest tight, my heart hammering in my ears. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel the temperature drop again, the cold seeping into my bones. I didn't know where to go. There was nowhere safe, nowhere to hide. And then I heard it, the soft sound of breathing. It was coming from the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the dim light. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. And there, standing just outside the reach of the light, was the woman again. She was different this time. Her face was gaunt, hollow, her eyes wide and unblinking. There was no warmth in her expression, just an unrelenting emptiness. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Just the sound of ragged breathing, the sound of something struggling to speak. And then, as if she were trying to force the words from her throat, she whispered, You opened it." I took a step back, fear taking over. This was it. The thing in the basement, the creature behind the door, was coming. It was here and it wanted me. But I didn't have a choice. There was no escape. I backed away, running towards the only exit I hadn't yet explored, the door to the basement. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly down into darkness, and as I descended, I could feel the temperature drop even further. The whispers were louder here, a cacophony of voices, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as if they were all speaking at once, growing more insistent with each step I took. The basement smelled different too. It wasn't just the damp, earthy scent I had become accustomed to. No, this was something fouler, like rot, like death. It filled my nostrils, stinging the back of my throat. And in the far corner of the room I saw it. The same figure standing still, watching me with its eyes, those hollow eyes that seemed to see through me into the very core of my being. The whispers grew louder as I moved closer, and then just as I reached the figure, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something cracking, something breaking. I turned to see the wall, the very wall that had concealed the hidden door, begin to split apart. The crack ran up the side, jagged and sharp, as though the house itself was being torn open. The thing inside, the thing I had unknowingly freed, was coming. And there was no stopping it now. I had no time to think. The crack in the wall was spreading quickly, widening like the gaping mouth of a beast, hungry for its next meal. I could feel the air grow heavier, more oppressive, the weight of it pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The whispers reached a crescendo, a maddening chorus of voices, each one indistinguishable from the next, all speaking in unison, urging me to move closer, urging me to open my eyes, to see what had been waiting in the darkness. But I knew better. I had already seen enough. The room seemed to warp around me. The walls were no longer just walls. They felt like they were breathing, shifting, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. The very foundation of the house was trembling, as if it too was being torn apart, ripped open by the thing that had been trapped for so long. I could feel it now, the presence behind the wall. It wasn't just a figure, a shadow. It was something vast, something ancient, something so old that it had long forgotten what it was to be human. It was beyond comprehension, beyond logic. It was something that existed in the space between the worlds, a thing that had been held at bay by rituals and seals, by the will of those who had come before me. But now that seal was breaking, and it was coming for me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The thing was closer now. I could feel it. I could almost hear its thoughts, its hunger. It was looking at me, studying me, sensing my fear. I turned and ran. I didn't know where to go, didn't know what direction I was even headed in. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was coming through that crack as possible. The stairs were behind me, and the hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and endless. But as I turned the corner, I skidded to a halt. There, at the end of the hallway, was another figure. It was her again, the woman with the hollow eyes. But she wasn't the same. She was twisted now, her body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, her limbs too long, too thin. Her skin was stretched tight across her bones, and her mouth was open in a silent scream, a scream that seemed to reverberate in the air around me. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The woman took a step toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes were locked on mine, and I could feel her gaze like icy needles digging into my skin. "You can't escape," she whispered, her voice a rasping hiss that sent shivers down my spine. "The door is open, and now it will take you." I turned to run, but it was too late. The floor beneath me shifted, buckled, and I felt myself falling, plunging into the darkness. My body slammed into the floor with a sickening thud, and for a moment, everything went black. When I came to, I was in the basement again. The room was dark, but I could feel it. I could feel the presence pressing in on me, the air thick and heavy with something I couldn't name. The walls were still cracking, still splitting apart, as if the house was unraveling, the very fabric of reality itself tearing at the seams. And then I saw it. The thing. It was standing in the corner, its form a shifting mass of shadows and darkness. I couldn't make out its shape, couldn't understand what it was, but I could feel it. Its eyes, its gaze, its hunger. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, like something that existed outside of time and space, a creature of pure malice and ancient power. The thing moved toward me, its form undulating, twisting in ways that defied logic. It was too fast, too strange. My legs wouldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a drum of terror, a warning that I didn't know how to heed. And then, as it reached me, I saw its face. It wasn't a face, not in the traditional sense. It was a mask, a smooth, featureless surface like marble, but it was cracked, the cracks running deep into the surface as if the face was slowly breaking apart. I could see something behind the mask, something that shouldn't have been there. Eyes. Eyes that were too many, too wide, too far apart. Eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. And the whispers, they were coming from it now, all of them, all at once, screaming, shouting, begging, pleading. "Join us," the thing whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices blended together. "Become one with us." I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, but I was frozen. My mind was trapped in the darkness, in the pull of its gaze, in the weight of its presence. "Please," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. "What are you? What do you want from me?" The creature's form rippled, the shadows around it shifting like smoke. And then it spoke again. "We are the forgotten," it said, its voice echoing in my mind. "The lost ones. The ones trapped between the worlds. And now you have set us free. You have opened the door. And now we are hungry." I could feel it closing in, the darkness wrapping around me, consuming everything in its path. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't escape. The thing reached out, its many hands, too many hands, grasping at me, pulling me toward it, pulling me into the shadows. I struggled, but it was no use. Its grip was too strong. "Join us," it whispered again, "and we will be whole." I screamed. I fought. I tried to break free. But the shadows were all around me, filling my lungs, suffocating me. And then everything went dark. The darkness wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. Every muscle in my body screamed in terror, but no sound escaped my mouth. The hands, no, not hands, not human, gripped me with an unrelenting force, pulling me toward the center of that terrifying, shapeless mass. The air was thick with an ancient, musty smell, as though I was being swallowed by the very earth itself. I thought I was going to die. I thought this was the end. But then, just as suddenly as it had all started, everything stopped. I was alone. I blinked rapidly, disoriented. The darkness around me was still there, but it had a different quality now. It wasn't the deep, oppressive void it had been before. No, it was lighter somehow. A dull, grayish hue bled into the surroundings, like the first light of dawn before the sun had fully risen. And then I realized. The walls were gone. The basement, the house, it was all gone. I was no longer in the space I had known. I was in something else entirely. I took a step forward, my body trembling. The floor beneath my feet was uneven, jagged, as if it was made of broken stone, pieces of something long forgotten. The air was still, thick with an unnatural silence. The whispers had stopped. The eyes were gone. But I wasn't free. I looked around, trying to make sense of where I was. It was a place that defied reason. A place between places. The world around me seemed to bend and fold in on itself, as if the very laws of reality were being twisted and distorted. There were no straight lines, no corners. Everything swirled in a way that made my head spin. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape. Something in the distance, something small and flickering. But as I moved toward it, it grew larger, clearer. It was a door. But it wasn't just any door. This door was unlike anything I had ever seen. Its frame was ancient, worn, covered in strange symbols and markings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The door itself was a dull, deep red, as though it had been carved from the blood of some ancient beast. It pulsed with an energy I couldn't describe, as though it were alive, breathing. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick again, suffocating, and I knew that if I approached this door, if I opened it, I would be crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This was no ordinary threshold. It was the door to something else, something beyond my understanding. It was the thing that had been waiting all along. But it wasn't just the door that drew me in. It was the faintest sound, like a whisper coming from the other side. "Come back." I flinched, my body recoiling. I knew that voice. It was the same voice that had whispered to me in the house, the same voice that had followed me, coaxing me, begging me to stay. The voice of the thing behind the door. I took a step back. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to run. But my body didn't listen. My feet moved forward as if drawn by some invisible force. I was no longer in control. Something else was guiding me, pushing me toward that cursed door. "Come back." The voice repeated, softer now but clearer. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me like a dark omen. The door was within reach now. I could feel the heat radiating from it, a warmth that seemed to burn my skin, searing me with its intensity. The symbols on the door pulsed, shifting as if they were alive. They were watching me. They were waiting. I reached out, my fingers trembling. As I touched the door, a jolt of electricity shot through my body, making me gasp in pain. The door shuddered, and the symbols shifted again, their shapes twisting and contorting into something grotesque, something that made my stomach turn. The voice on the other side was louder now, more insistent, like a chant, a mantra that I couldn't escape. Join us, become one." I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to step through it. But I was already beyond reason, beyond choice. The house had consumed me, the thing behind the door had consumed me. And now it was taking me into the depths of its world. I pushed the door open. The world on the other side was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a realm of shifting shadows, twisted landscapes, and nightmarish shapes that danced at the edge of my vision. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot, and the ground beneath me felt unstable, like it could collapse at any moment. The whispers were louder now, and the eyes, they were everywhere. Watching, waiting, all around me, in the shadows, in the air itself. They watched as I stepped forward into this new, horrible reality. And then, from the depths of the darkness, I saw it. The thing. It was no longer just a shape, no longer just a mass of shadows. It had form now. It was towering, its body long and twisted, covered in jagged, protruding bones and sinew. Its face was a patchwork of eyes, all staring at me with an intensity that burned into my soul. Its mouth was wide, too wide, filled with rows upon rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to glisten in the pale, sickly light. It stepped forward, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. The whispers grew into a cacophony of voices, all screaming, all chanting, all calling my name. And then it spoke. Armine. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't escape. I was trapped. Forever. The world around me was a blur, a nightmare made real. The thing loomed over me, its jagged form stretching impossibly tall, its many eyes watching me with a hunger that chilled my bones. My body was frozen, locked in place, every muscle screaming for release, but it was as if I was rooted to the ground. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was stand there, helpless, as the thing drew closer. Its mouth stretched wider, revealing rows of needle-like teeth that seemed to glow in the unnatural light. The whispers were deafening now, each voice overlapping the other, filling my head with a maddening symphony of chaos. They were calling my name. They were inviting me in. "Join us," the creature whispered, its voice a sickening mixture of countless voices, each one rasping and pleading, "You are ours now." I wanted to run. I wanted to claw my way out of this hellish place and escape, but the air was thick, suffocating. The ground beneath me shifted like quicksand, threatening to swallow me whole. It was as if the very fabric of reality had come undone, and I was trapped in this twisted, nightmarish realm with no way out. The thing leaned closer, its breath rancid, carrying the stench of death and decay. It reached out a long, gnarled hand. No, not a hand, but something far worse, something unnatural and grotesque. Its fingers were like broken branches, twisted and sharp, and as they hovered just inches from my skin, I could feel the coldness radiating from them, like the touch of death itself. I should have run. I should have done something, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, as though the very sight of it had stolen my will to fight. And then the thing spoke again, this time not in whispers but in a voice so loud, so full of power, that it shook the very ground beneath me. Your soul is ours. Forever. The words reverberated through my entire being, and in that moment I understood. This wasn't just a house. It wasn't just some forgotten evil that had waited for centuries. No, this was bigger than that. This was a place between worlds, a bridge between realms. And I had opened it. I had unwittingly allowed the thing to pass through, to awaken from its long slumber. And now it was claiming me. I could feel it then, the change. The thing's touch was not just physical. It was invasive. It crawled beneath my skin, into my blood, into my very soul. It was marking me, binding me to it, to this place, to this cursed existence. And there was no escape. There would never be an escape. The darkness swirled around me, wrapping me in its cold embrace, and I felt my body give way. The ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling into nothingness. But even as I plummeted, I knew that I wasn't really falling. No, I was being pulled deeper into the creature's realm, pulled into its endless void. I could hear the voices again, louder now. The voices of those who had come before me, the ones who had been claimed by the house, by the thing behind the door. They were screaming, begging for release, for salvation. But there would be no salvation. There would be no escape. And then, in the midst of it all, I saw a face. It wasn't the thing's face, but it was something just as horrifying. It was the woman. The one with the hollow eyes. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes wide and unblinking, filled with terror and sorrow. But there was something else in her gaze. Something that seemed familiar, something that felt like a warning. She reached out toward me, her hand trembling, her voice breaking through the chaos. Don't let it take you. But before I could reach her, the world around me shattered. The darkness engulfed her, swallowing her whole, and I was left alone in the void. The voices returned, louder now, more insistent. They were all around me, in my ears, in my mind. There was no escape. There was only the void, the thing, and me. And then the door appeared again. The red door. But this time it wasn't a door to a room. It was a door to something else. A door to eternity. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and as I touched it, I felt the last of my humanity slip away. My soul was no longer mine. It belonged to the house. It belonged to the thing that waited beyond the door. And in that final moment I understood. I had opened the door. And now there was no going back. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the same way in this place. Seconds, minutes, hours. None of it matters. Nothing matters except the cold, suffocating presence that surrounds me, the whispers that never stop, the eyes that are always watching, always waiting. I've lost track of everything. The world I once knew feels like a distant memory, like something I read in a book and forgot the moment I closed it. There's no escape from this place. No salvation. The thing behind the door has taken me, just like it took the others, just like it's taken everyone who has ever stepped foot into the house. We are all here now, trapped in this twisted, endless realm between worlds, where the only thing that exists is the hunger, the darkness, and the cycle. It doesn't end. It never ends. I can still feel it. The thing, the presence that watches over everything. It's always there, always just out of sight, its many eyes studying me, studying all of us. The whispers come from everywhere, from the walls, from the air, from the darkness itself. They tell me stories, stories of those who came before me, of those who thought they could escape, who thought they could survive. But none of them did. And neither will I. I tried to move, to do something, anything, but my body doesn't obey me. It's as though I've become part of the walls, part of the house, part of whatever terrible thing this place has become. I am nothing but a shadow now, drifting in the darkness, trapped in the very essence of the house. And then I hear it again, the voice of the woman, the one with the hollow eyes. Her face is burned into my mind, her words echoing in my ears. Don't let it take you. But it's too late. It already has. I hear the door again, the red door that led me here, the one that calls me. I know what's on the other side now, I've seen it. I've been there. It's the same for all of us. The cycle repeats over and over again, and we are all trapped in it, unable to break free. I try to scream, but there's no sound. There's nothing but the darkness, the whispers, and the thing that waits. And then something changes. The door appears before me, but it isn't the same. It's no longer just a red door, an entrance to the void. It's a door to the past. A door to the beginning. I can see it now, the house, the very same house I once lived in. I see it as it was before everything went wrong, before the rituals, before the curse. I see the people who lived there, the ones who brought this darkness into the world. And I understand now. This wasn't just a house. It was a prison, a trap set by those who came before me, those who opened the door and released the thing that waits. They thought they could control it, thought they could use it for their own gain. But they were wrong. They were fools. And now I am one of them. I step forward, my hand trembling as I reach for the door. I don't know why. I don't know what's on the other side, but I know I have to open it. I have to go back to the beginning, back to where it all started. I open the door. The house is there just as it was before. The creaky floorboards, the dusty air, the eerie silence that hangs heavy in every room. But something is different. The walls feel closer now, as if they're closing in on me, pressing down with a weight I can't escape. I look around. It's the same, but it's not. And then I hear it, the footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming from above. Coming from the room where it all began. I don't want to go up there. I know what waits. I know what's been waiting. But my legs move on their own, carrying me up the stairs, to that room, to the place where everything started to unravel. I open the door to the room. It's empty, but I can feel it. The presence. It's here. It's always been here. And then I see it. The crack in the wall. The same crack that started it all. It's bigger now, wider, as though it's been waiting for me for this moment. The air grows colder, the whispers louder. The thing behind the wall is awake. It's waiting for me. I back away slowly, but I can't escape. I can't move. And then the door slams shut behind me. I'm trapped again. In this house. In this cycle. And I know it now. The house isn't just a place. It's a prison. And I've always been here. Always will be. The thing behind the wall is calling me again. Its whispers growing louder. Its eyes staring into my soul. I can feel its hunger, its need to consume me, to make me a part of it. And I know what it wants. It wants me to join it. To become one with it. To become a part of the house. Forever.